All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar called How to Help Your High Achieving Underperformer. We're going to talk about executive functioning for high school students. Um, Real quick, I know people don't need a long bio for me, but I am Skylar Lutostanski. I am the managing director here at Galin. We also work with college students through State Street Education. I think what I want people to know as I talk on this topic today is sort of like where I'm coming from. Um, so what we do, and some people on the call may know this, is we do executive function coaching. We work with high school students. We certainly work with college students. But what I'll be talking about today is really just from what we're seeing with students when we're working with them in high school, and also what the research says. Our typical program is students come and get a coach, and they meet on a weekly basis, and we focus on building up the executive function skills, building consistency, developing these skills and helping students work towards their goals. And so when we work with students on, say, a semester or yearly basis, we see a lot from them and can learn a lot. And so some of what I'm talking about today definitely comes from that work. I typically like to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes. So just as you're starting this up, if you're wondering how long it's going to go, although I guess it probably has a timestamp, that should be the length. All right, so who are we talking about today? The title of this is High Achieving Underperformers. Um, that's kind of it, right? It's these bright students who are really capable of a lot, but what we're seeing that's happening in real life is not there, right? So I have this capability versus ability, and some people refer to that as this gap, right? And I said the skills gap of, well, what are the skills that are um, impeding the student? What are the skills that are causing struggles for the student where they're not getting closer to what they're capable of? Um, and so, when we look at these bright students who are struggling, I like to use the words a lot of times content and process, right? And so, a lot of what I have seen over the last 15 years of working with students is that it's not typically the content that is the main struggle for them, although there are parts of that. But usually it's not like, hey, I'm in US history class and this is just way too hard for me to learn. It's usually more of the process. It's usually more the skills, certainly executive function skills, but also some academic skills that go into that are causing some of these struggles, maybe not hitting their goals, maybe getting more disengaged from school. And so what we're talking about today is really like, what are some areas to look at? What are some areas to focus on as a parent and think about with your kid, and really work towards like long-term growth, work towards how can we get better at these skills and how can we become more consistent? And that very bottom one is a very loaded word, motivation. I hear motivation all the time. Um, when I meet parents and they say, my kid just really needs to get motivated. And there might be people on this recording that are thinking, yeah, my kid's just not motivated. I look at them, what I'm seeing each day, each week, like they don't care about school. Um, Building motivation is really hard to do. I often say we can't convince kids to be more motivated. We can't just tell them and pep talk them into being more motivated. But what we can do, and the way I look at motivation is there's really two ways to become more motivated, whether we're talking about school or other things. One is internally. One is like I'm maturing, I'm developing, my mindset is changing, I'm working with a therapist, I'm on medication. Like there's a lot of different things of okay, internally something's changing where I'm becoming more motivated to reach my goals. The other side of it, and the side that I'm going to kind of live on tonight, is more motivated by external things. I'm picking up victories. I have less homework assignments. Ooh, now I got an 87 on that test. I used to get 62s. Like I'm picking up wins. I'm starting to feel better for myself. And now I'm sort of re-engaging with school or putting more into school and feeling more connected. And so I think that's really important because as I talk today, um, to me, that's kind of what we're after is like victory, victory, victory. And it kind of builds on that consistency, this process improving. These are words you're going to hear me kind of continue to use as I talk about this student population. Okay, here's the executive functions. Um, a few things I'll point out about that. There's infinite types of lists for the executive functions. This is just the one I use. So if you look up a blog or Google something or whatever, read a book, they're going to have a different list. This is my list. I have the definition right there. I don't think I need to read it. Um, but I do like to highlight the emotional piece of it, the emotional regulation, because I often spotlight that as one of the more important ones. And I refer to it as the light dimmer of the frontal lobe, right? The frontal lobe is where all this executive functioning is happening. And so when we look at the emotions, and sometimes I like to put them on like a 1 to 10 scale, right? 10 being um, very high emotions, anxiety, um, you know, attention, hyperactivity, like different things like that, versus low emotions would be the extreme. At least I'm thinking like 0, 1, 2 would be like depression, and things like that. And so if we put emotions on a scale, the more towards the center they are, the higher up the executive functioning, the frontal lobe is, that light dimmer. As we start to swing our emotions more towards the 1, 2 range, the 8, 9 range, um, that light dimmer starts to go down on what we're able to do with our executive functions. And so if we think like the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever, I'm using numbers here, but in that more um, mid-range, that more typical range, we're better able to meet the demand of what we have to do each day with our executive functions. If we look at somebody who, let's say, is depressed and they're down in that 1, 2 range, what happens to them is that when we are depressed, our frontal lobe, truly the dimmer is all the way down, our frontal lobe shuts off. It is difficult to um, initiate. It is difficult to plan things. It's difficult to manage our time and even think. It's certainly difficult to regulate our emotions. And on the other side of it, there's a phrase that often gets thrown around that is like crippling anxiety. Um, well, when people have anxiety and it is out of control, it will do the same thing. It will shut down that frontal lobe, um, and it will make it very difficult to kind of function day to day, week to week. And so I always want parents to think of that before I get going, of like, what is the current state of my student? If I'm thinking of a high achieving underperformer, what is the current state of their emotional makeup, their mindset, their where they are just in terms of that mental space. So it is a crucial element, and that's why I like to highlight it here at this slide before I really start going and digging in. And finally, intelligence does not equal executive functioning ability. In fact, um, many people say they are inversely related. Um, you know, Another common phrase, the absent-minded professor. But I think that kind of speaks to this slide of like, oh yeah, the genius professor who's brilliant, but at the same time, like maybe he can't, find his keys or tie his shoes or get to work on time. But something I do see, because these are students who are underperforming based on their ability, is that they know that, and it's frustrating to them. And this kind of ties into that emotional piece I was talking about. But um, students know from a very early age, like, oh, I'm getting pulled out in the high reading group, or my uncle told me I'm so smart. He hasn't seen me in 2 months, and then I read a book for him when I was 4. They kind of absorb this stuff most of their lives. So then if they are all of a sudden underperforming in school, let's say it's in high school, since that's what we're talking about today, it really can impact their emotional functioning a lot. So I see, like, I wrote moral dilemma on here. Well, the moral dilemma I see is students fight and fight and fight. Let's say they're in AB Calc. They're in a calculus math class. Um, and they're doing horribly, just not doing any work, bombing things. It's going very poorly. So then the team decides, well, hey, let's switch you down into the lower math class for this year. It should take some stress off. It should be easier. And then what do I see? I often see that student actually do even worse in the easier class, which should be very easy for them. And it is because of that last line here on that slide, but like the impact on their identity or their self-esteem, and how the way that they see themselves, or the way that they have been, all these inputs I was talking about, these inputs they've gotten through their whole life, like I'm high achieving, I'm pretty bright, I'm smart, I do well in school, I do better than other kids. When real life is misaligned with that, that can really cause some dilemmas, that can cause, self-esteem issues. It can certainly challenge their identity and the way they see themselves, and can be pretty impactful. So I always like to, highlight that as I'm going through the emotional piece as well. All right, so why do we need the executive function skills? Well, I've been using this quote for about 15 years now, and it's starting to get outdated. But a study did find that the executive functions predict children's success as well, if not better than IQ tests. I mean, the moral of the story is, if students are able to function extremely well, and plan and manage and organize their day and their schoolwork, they're going to do well in high school, in college, and beyond. Um, all right, so the basics. What is difficult? Now we're thinking about the high achieving underperforming student, and we're thinking, okay, what are the most difficult tasks? Well, here's what's going to be most difficult: something that is newer, something that's more complex, and something that's more long term. So sometimes, we'll be working with a high school freshman, and they'll come in and they'll say, hey, I have this paper that has to compare this character from this book to this character from this book, and it's a 5-page research paper, and I need 3 citations, and it's due in 8 weeks. Well, that's pretty complex. And 8 weeks is pretty long term. And writing a 5-page paper or comparing characters across books, or all the, maybe even just researching and citing things, all these things are new. That is going to put a ton of demand on the executive functions. That is really going to ask the executive functions to kind of rise to the challenge. And so that is a very difficult task. And we can start thinking about, it doesn't have to be that complex. I mean, just moving to high school from middle school sometimes is a big jump up, just in terms of maybe some different moving parts. Um, and so when we think about, well, what do students need, especially when looking at the executive functions that are going to make these difficult tasks not as difficult? Well, quite frankly, it is the opposite of that. What we want students to do is learn, okay, how do I make things through strategies, through systems, through habits, through routines, through just learning? Well, how do I make things more familiar, less complex, less long term, right? So newer, more complex, more long term is going to be difficult. This is the goal, and I like to frame it this way for parents too. When they think, well, what can help my student? Well, what can help your student is something that you do that is going to accomplish at least one of these things, right? And I do think most parents know, like, okay, I'm going to help my kid make a schedule with deadlines. Okay, well, that's definitely helping make it less long term. I'm going to break down the assignment. Let's make it less complex, right? So, um, so that's really the goal. And I always try to simplify the goal as much as I can. So let's look at some specific areas here. Definitely some executive functions where um, students, they struggle, and these are good areas to focus on. And I'm going to go through a few of these. Some may apply to your students, some may not. But the first one's organization, right? High achieving underperformers, it is pretty common that they struggle with their organization, right? All of these things happen. Definitely the assignments, like that is what I hear in a lot of my meetings when I initially meet families, is the missing assignments is really a challenge. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee here. I do think that organization is straightforward. I need a system. I need a very clear system that is burned into my brain. I need to know where everything is supposed to go. Um, and I need to be able to cognitively think through that. I like to use the term the cognitive roadmap when it comes to these executive function skills. That definition page I had up said that the executive functions are a neurological skill set, right? They exist up here. It's about thinking, it's about executing. And so I like to use the term cognitive roadmap, because when it comes to these skills, we need to really have students be able to go down the correct cognitive roadmap. So for example, the Rush Neurobehavioral Center in Chicago does a lot of research on the executive functions. And for organization, a simple way I think to look at it is they have something they call the one-touch method, which means that let's say the math teacher is handing out, I don't know how often this happens these days, but let's say they're handing out an actual piece of paper to the student, and they say, this worksheet has to come back tomorrow and be turned in. It's homework. The one touch method says the student touches it one time and it goes exactly where it needs to go immediately. Now, I like to take that further, and I like to say the hierarchy of organizational systems, right? So if I have this organizational hierarchy, I should the cognitive roadmap, I should be able to go through my hierarchy um, as that paper's hitting my hand, right? So maybe I get handed a math thing and I say, okay, well, that goes in my backpack, and then it goes in my binder in my backpack, and then it goes in my math folder in my binder, and then it goes in the left pocket. And that is my organizational hierarchy. That is me going through the cognitive roadmap of knowing where it is. Now, I wouldn't be able to get there unless I actually set up a system and practiced it over and over and over. And I even like to do that exercise with students where I say, hey, here's the teacher, here's the thing I'm giving you, where does it go? And I want them to break it down. And the same thing these days really needs to exist electronically, right? We need to clear out the Google Drive. Usually students, if they're in high school, they've had it since kindergarten or whenever, and it's full of just all types of junk. And it's like, all right, let's clean it out. Fresh slate. I actually tell students make an archive folder, just drag everything into the archive folder and poof, your Google Drive is clean. But then I need to make my folders by class. Maybe within each class, I have a long-term project or I have a unit or something, and I'm putting other docs in those. And I'm sort of just making my folders, my subfolders, and I'm going smaller and smaller. That's really difficult for students. However, I want to ask that same question, like, okay, your history teacher is sharing, um, this type of assignment that's due in a week. Like, give me the hierarchy, give me the cognitive roadmap of where that document goes. The challenge with organization is really not the setup or things like that. It really is the consistency. It's like, how do I just keep going and going and going and practicing this so it becomes second nature, so it's not as difficult. And some of these things I'm talking about today, my hunch is this: there are some parents on this call who are maybe at their wits' end with their student, like, why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? Why isn't this happening? This is driving me crazy. I talk to parents all the time. I know that's probably some parents. Um, and at the end of the day, some of these things, even this thing I'm talking about, is putting a piece of paper in a folder, let's say, these things are not, they don't naturally come to all students. And so it's really hard as an adult to be like, why can't they just take the paper and put the paper in a folder? But it just doesn't come naturally. It takes practice, it takes attention, it takes focus, it takes effort. And so for organization, these are really the building blocks that need to happen. Because at the end of the day, we just want that to be consistent, consistent, consistent until it does become natural, right? Um, Okay, well, let's move on to time management, right? A lot of students procrastinating, waiting to the last second, really not fun Sunday nights. Maybe I've certainly seen plenty of students who get the pile up of assignments, and then it basically is like, okay, you have 25 missing assignments. You have ruined this family's weekend. I'm now going to put my hand on your shoulder, and you're going to do hours and hours of homework until you finish, and it's really miserable for everyone. I know that happens all the time. So um, similar to organization, like a lot of these things are going to follow that same structural format of like, it needs to be set up, it needs to have a clear cognitive roadmap, and it needs to be practiced. And so with time management, what I find is students sort of need these different tiers to really be able to understand what they have on their plate, how they need to manage their time, and then really like what they have to do. Um, and so if I broke the tiers down really fast, tier one is big picture stuff. It's what are those big things? Papers, tests, projects. I'm mapping out my world in terms of, oh, I'm in school from 8 to 3:30. I have, you know, volleyball practice from 3:45 to 5:45 every night, and then I'm getting home. It's just mapping out their time literally visually. Google Calendar is probably the best way to go with this. That's what we encourage most students to use. No need to reinvent the wheel. Google Calendar works. I'm sure plenty of people here use it for work and personal life. Um, and so step one is mapping it out. Let me just map out where my time's going and when, and let me get those big things on here: tests, projects, papers. I know in high school, students don't always get the most runtime leading up to a test. Sometimes they only learn about a test like 2, 3 days in advance, even. AP classes are better. Usually math classes are a little better, but just getting used to kind of mapping out in their time and identifying those bigger things. Um, that's step one, because ultimately students need to be able to understand where they need to be and when, and then obviously how to plan around that and backwards plan from these bigger events. Um, so that's tier one, and that's kind of like the start of the roadmap. Tier two is really, we call it the master list, but it's like, what's everything I have to do for the next 2 weeks? In college, all this stuff is very easy, by the way, because you get the syllabus for the whole semester right away. In high school, you kind of have to roll with the punches, but it's really looking at like, what are all the things? Oh, I have a test coming up in this class. I have a quiz coming up in this class. I have a Spanish worksheet probably almost every night. I have math homework problems every night. And really mapping it out day by day is tier two of like, I just need to have a clear understanding. And tier three is, well, what do I need to do today? Today I need to, and be specific, right? Today I need to, um, today I need to, a lot of students will say, oh, I need to study for my math quiz tomorrow. It's like, okay, that's not very specific. Or, oh, I need to study for my history test or my history quiz tomorrow. Okay, well, that's not specific. Because what's more specific is like, I need to make flashcards for all the terms in chapter seven and chapter eight, and then I need to study them. And then I have a couple short answers I need to answer, and then I'm gonna, share my answers with a friend, and we're gonna compare and talk about it real quick, and then I'll kind of rehit everything or something like that, right? Being more specific. So I go, all right, I got all my big picture stuff. I got my master list, and now today is Wednesday. What do I need to get done on Wednesday? Here's my actual task list for today when it comes to school. Certainly, they can include other things. Ultimately, what students need to do is be able to see that visual of their week and go through the exercise of planning and looking ahead and understanding where these things fit in their schedule so they just practice it. And the goal is, well, how do I figure out how to balance the short term and the long term? And again, reflecting on what I said, of some of these things don't come natural. um, I've worked with so many students where, um, let's say they go to West High School in Madison, and they're on the track team, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I have a track meet on Tuesday, but that's okay, that won't take too much time. And they just don't know where it is or what's happening. And then it comes out like, oh, it's actually in Beloit. Well, Beloit, that's like 50 minutes away. You're going to go down there. The track meet's going to be 4 hours. You're going to have another 50 minutes back. Like, you're not getting home till like 9 o'clock. And so students really need to start going through this exercise of, um, having the system. And then again, it's about consistency. It's about, I think that's one of the benefits of coaching, honestly, is when you work with a coach and you have these clear goals each week, it is easier to have that accountability and work towards the constant, um, doing of these things, but also building that consistency, because I know it's tough sometimes in the parent role to build these things out and not have your messages be received in, a negative way. I like to use the term analyze the task. That means break the test down into smaller steps, right? Oh, I have a, history test on Friday, and today is Monday. Well, let me break it down. Let me understand what it covers, the materials I want to prioritize, how I want to study, how much time that's going to take. Like, I need to break this down, and then I should probably also add that to my Google Calendar of when I plan on doing this and what I plan on doing. And so all of these things, this like consistency of doing this day after day, checking my websites, getting things in, mapping it out on the Google Calendar, thinking through my daily task list, like, they're just things that we need to build for these students, because oftentimes these are those process things that are, getting in the way for students, and they don't like it either. They don't. They're probably frustrated. This is a big one: initiation and attention. Um, Difficulty getting started and then going, right? Staying on task. I frame it this way, and I'm going to talk very specifically about when we work with students. I always say the goal when it comes to initiation, there will always be that moment where the student has to get started on their own. They sit down, they're at their desk in their room, they're at a table in the library. They have to like open up the computer or book and just get started. However, there's a lot that goes into that. And so when I view initiation, I always say the goal is, how do we increase the likelihood that you're able to get started when you want to? That is the goal. So there are students that come to us that are at 20%, right? They have tons of missing homework. They can't get started at home. They can't get started at study hall. We're not, it's not realistic to say, hey, you had 10 missing homework assignments last week. Next week you should have zero. To go from 10 missings to zero missings is not realistic. What is realistic is to say, hey, you're at 20% now. When we get to the semester's end, I want you to be at you're able to get started 70% of the time. And what we do to focus on that is first students really need to think about um, what goes into getting started, right? The word infrastructure is on here. Sometimes I call it the initiation infrastructure, but it's like, what are all the pieces that go into me getting started that are going to increase the likelihood that I'm able to get started? That could be things as simple as sound, right? What kind of sound do I need? Obviously, like where do I need to work? Having ideal environments for sure. Having places that are dedicated to work only and nothing else. Maybe it's your parents' office, maybe it's a Starbucks, in town, maybe it's the school library, whatever, but having these dedicated spaces, visually what's in front of them, what are the things they need to bring with them? I often compare initiation and attention to like when I bring my little kids on a road trip. But I'll be like, look, once you get started, keep it going. Like, bring all the things you need. If you need a snack, if you need a drink, if you need to go to the bathroom before you get started, like, do all of these things. Um, so that once you get started, you're able to stay on task. Um, and so it's really about there's a lot of these inputs, right? Of what goes into me being successful. The biggest one being the phone. Um, it's not rocket science. I mean, I'm working with a student right now who the phone is a really big problem for him, and the easiest answer is put it in another room. It's just a lot easier to say than to do. But it really needs to be out of sight because it will just really increase the likelihood that students are able to get started and then stay on task once they do get um, started. A big question that I get asked often is like about certain techniques for students, the Pomodoro technique, which is time on, time off, right? 15 minutes on, 5 minute break, 15 minutes on, 5 minute break. Um, it's a really variable student to student. What I have actually seen be more successful with students, and this is not all students, but the majority for me, in my experience of many years doing this, is taking breaks is such a double-edged sword that it actually backfires. And what I have found is that when students get started and are on task, to just go. So if you're trying to pound these Pomodoro techniques and time off, time on, time off, time on into your student, and it's not working, I would say more focus on, well, how do I get them started in the right state, um, working well, and then just ride it out and get as much work done as they can. I've actually seen a strategy that I've seen be really effective for students is time blocking, which is essentially taking increments of time, let's say 10 minutes, and planning out 10 minutes of time, sort of in like a table, honestly, just like, okay, I'm going to work for an hour. Here's what I'm doing every 10 minutes, but being specific with what's going to happen in 10 minutes. Oftentimes, students will say, I'm going to read my book. I'm going to read To Kill a Mockingbird for the first 10 minutes. And then the second 10 minutes, I'm going to read, and the third, and then I'm going to switch to math, and then math and math. Not good. But if I'm being detailed and I'm saying, okay, in the first 10 minutes, I'm going to read pages 75 to 82. And in the second 10 minutes, I'm going to read pages 82 to 91, or even math. Don't just say math or math homework or math 6.2, but say math problems 1 to 11 odd. And the next 10 minutes are going to be math problems 13 to 17 odd. And I'm actually mapping out specific goals and sort of amounts of work. Um, for what's going to happen in that time. It's really it gives a lot of feedback, right? It has goals, it has clear goals. Like, here's what I need to do in the next 10 minutes. It gives really good feedback. Okay, 10 minutes are up. Am I where I need to be? And it keeps students on task. So I have seen time blocking, for instance, be much more. I've seen students be able to do that for 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes at a time and be very focused, as opposed to what happens when they typically come in, where it's like, I always ask the question, okay, so if you sit down and do an hour of homework, well, how often are you actually on task doing work? And students will say, oh, yeah, my homework takes me an hour, but I'm probably only doing like 20 minutes of work. Um, we want to get those numbers closer together. Like if you have 20 minutes of work, then hopefully you're getting it done in about 20 minutes because you're on task. So time blocking I've seen be a really key strategy. But overall, the philosophy is, well, how do we put these things into place, this infrastructure to help our students get started make it more likely to get started, and then stay on task once they are started. Um, and this is our last one, and this is just, fancy words, but let's just call it study skills, right? Like, what are students doing to improve their learning? If there are students that are, high achieving underperformers, and maybe the area they're struggling in is um, their scores on tests, maybe, which maybe doesn't make sense. But then it comes down to, okay, again, it's not the content; it's something that's going into your process. It's something that's going into your skills here. So, um, again, working towards consistency, we find students that need to change the way they're doing note taking, or maybe start note taking. A lot of study skills. We often hear from students who just don't feel like they're getting a lot of bang for their buck, let's say, a lot of ROI on the studying that they're putting in. And it's because they're maybe not using the best study strategies. No studying has negative results, but there are certainly study strategies and methods that are going to be more effective and promote better learning and maybe more efficient even. Um, and so that we've definitely found that when students come and work with us, a lot of times it's okay, well, we need to introduce some study strategies, or we need to introduce some study methods, and really start to work to incorporate these things so that maybe those difficult classes that students are struggling in, and maybe they're sort of having a ripple effect, and if they're getting mostly A's and B's and everything, but then they're getting like a D in chemistry, and they don't like the teacher and they don't like the class, and then they need to find new strategies to sort of boost up that class a little bit. It can kind of like um, impact some other things too in a positive way when you start making progress, just like it can impact things in a negative way, even if it's one class. So a lot of times we find in terms of what students need to work on, it's more these academic skills of note taking, study skills, things like that. I've certainly talked to a lot of students who say, when my teacher tells us, okay, everyone go home and study for the test tomorrow, I have no idea what that means, and I have no idea what to do. Um, and so that is something to check in with students on and see how they feel about that, because sometimes that's the obstacle in the way. Okay. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this. Um, I always hope that everyone gets like one thing where they can take it and run with it, and have a conversation with their student, or dig further into. Um, but here are the main takeaways for me. And I actually want to jump down to that fourth bullet point, which is, this is a process. Like, this takes a while. I've used the word consistency about 50 times on this recording. But it is true, like, it takes time. And I often compare like the executive functions to like measuring your height on a wall, where it's like, all right, I stand with my back on the wall and I make a tick with a pencil. Um, and then you come back 2 months later and it's like, am I taller? Am I not taller? Like, we didn't notice you growing, but then you make a tick and it's like, oh, I grew an inch and a half. It's hard to see in real time sometimes, even when it's happening. Um, but it is a process, right? And look at there's that word consistent again in that last bullet point, but like, it is about consistent work and attention and effort, and really focusing on building these skills up. I think high school is a great time to start thinking about these skills. Obviously, when kids go to college, the environment shifts. They have way more control. They have way more unstructured time. There's more at stake in terms of education, money on the line, things like that. Stuff costs, tuition is expensive. So um, I do think with those high achieving, underperforming students, this is a really good area to kind of evaluate and think about your student, and really think like, what are these areas that we can focus on and try to build up, and really help our kid get closer to what they're capable of, and like really build their skills and build them up and their self-esteem and things like that. So I really hope everyone enjoyed listening to this. I hope you guys all got something out of it. Here, I'll leave on my screen for about 10 seconds here, but here's my contact info if anyone wants to get a hold of me. I'm Scott L at galined.com. And I'm more than happy to chat further with anyone if they have, questions or just want to ask me my thoughts about their student or run some things by me, I'm always available and pretty easy to get a hold of. Thank you. Have a great day.